Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne. So what have you been reading?
I have been rereading The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. And you?
I've been reading Margareta von Oswald's Working Through Colonial Collections, an ethnography of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. And I've been thinking a lot about museums in general.
All right, well, let's talk about it. And listeners, please go get yourself a drink, pull up a seat, and join us for a conversation about these books and more here at the Spouter-Inn. You have had museums on the brain for a little while now.
For like 5 years, if not longer, but like a lot I was reflecting on this for like definitely about 5 years. And I think it started out like, you remember when we were at the Aga Khan Museum together in 2021 for an exhibition that I'd worked on with Melissa Moreton? Remember we did a little bonus episode with her?
Yeah. It was a very interesting exhibit.
Yeah, of like sort of books along the Silk Roads, right? And that was the first time I had the opportunity to co-curate a show, and that really was a real Pandora's box for me of just opening up interest in museums and how they work, and I haven't been able to leave it behind.
Well, we will talk about that soon enough. Although I will say, on that question of like, how do museums work? I had a weird moment recently. I was at the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario, sort of the big museum here in Toronto. And they're doing one of those things that museums sometimes do, where they've got an exhibit that is representing a gift.
Mm-hmm.
So-and-so has given a bunch of art to the museum, and now they're going to have an exhibit with their name on it for a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was very odd to go to it. Like it was a perfectly lovely collection. I'm glad the museum has it. This is all fine. But it was a name that I saw, and I was like, I have seen this name recently, haven't I? And I had, because I had just been to a concert. A pianist was playing. Mikey and I did a scene on the scene about it. And if I remember correctly, that person's name had shown up there as well as supporting the artist appearing there. I was like, who is this person?
Patronage. Well,
turns out he was a former director of Rogers, a major telecommunications company up here. Think about like former AT&T director level type thing, who passed away 2 years ago, and so is dispersing all of his art and money. And it's just one of those moments where you're like, this is how this works, isn't it? Like, you can see a little bit behind the scenes about how things move into museums and how these kinds of cultural events happen.
Yeah, and it's super interesting because on the one hand, it's a really long history. Like think back to the Medici or whoever, like about art patronage, right? That's how artists were able to do their work in many cases. It was through these kinds of patrons that would support them. And yet it's also a very, very modern story that has a kind of whole set of technical financial ramifications to do with the tax code and so on, right? So it's on the one hand a very long story, but on the other hand a very present moment story.
And you're going there and you're looking at the art, but then, I don't know, you keep being pulled back, not to like the glory of this generous person, but just kind of the way money is lying behind all of these decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's really interesting. And like not really how we sometimes like to think about art and artists operating in the world. Like, artists got to make a living.
Yeah, we like to imagine that there's not a marketplace, but there absolutely is. And it doesn't take away from the power of the art, whether it's music or other forms of art, right? But there's also this apparatus that's holding it up.
Yeah.
And, I think one of the moments that we feel that, or at least this is in my mind because of an experience I had just yesterday, when we feel that most acutely that even though there's this machine, there's also something absolutely wonderful at the center of it. I had the chance yesterday to spend some time in an artist studio.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was really great. I had met him earlier this year and at an opening at the Rutgers Art Museum, the Zimmerli Art Museum, where a piece of his work was being exhibited. And then we visited together in New York, and then we visited together in Philadelphia, where he's in a 6-month residency. The artist's name is Norman Akers, and he's an Osage artist who you will not be surprised when I tell you his work incorporates many different ways of representing place, including maps.
Yeah.
So you will not be surprised that I'm absolutely in love with his work.
Yeah.
But he's also such an interesting person and very generous with his time. So it was really great to go there with a couple of young folks and visit the studio and talk to him. And so even though there is this apparatus of the world, there's also this very beautiful thing at the center of it.
Yeah. This is the thing about museums is that they can obscure the sort of the work of the artist themselves, right? Like, how is this painting being made? How is it, whatever it is, art, photograph or whatever? Like, you're just seeing a finished product and you're not thinking about, well, what was some exhibits try to get to that, but like you kind of can't. And if you know artists, if you are friends with artists, or if you visit an artist studio, I don't know, you get to see a little bit more of the reality of it.
Yeah.
And like, it's not mandatory to approach it from that way. There are all sorts of valid approaches to looking at art, of course, but it is lovely when you get to actually experience the
process, right?
process,
and have
like
a chance to talk together about it, right?
Yeah.
No, it's a really good experience. And you see in museums, they sometimes try to give you a simulacrum of that. Like you'll sometimes see they'll sort of stage artists' materials. Or one time I saw in a Boston museum, they were representing Georgia O'Keeffe's working space. And I'm like, yeah, this is a little cringy. It's like,
yeah, or like a documentary of the artist working. I've seen like Agnes Martin exhibits where you also get to see a documentary of her making her paintings. But like, that's good.
Yeah. I mean, like, and it's nice to have a glimpse of that, but it's a shadow, I think, of having a chance to visit the workplace.
And I mean, I suppose we're doing something similar here when we talk about books or fiction, where we are looking at the product, and we sometimes mention the biography, or we might have some access to the thought processes of the writer as they're putting this together. But like, then those are different sides of a coin. But I don't know. It is sometimes good to remember that these don't just exist as finished products. Is he stuffed? Asked the lion in surprise, as he watched her pick up the Scarecrow and set him up on his feet while she patted him into shape again. Of course he's stuffed, replied Dorothy, who was still angry. That's why he went over so easily, remarked the lion. It astonished me to see him whirl around so. Is the other one stuffed also? No, said Dorothy, he's made of tin. And she helped the Woodman up again. That's why he nearly blunted my claws, said the lion. When they scratched against the tin, it made a cold shiver run down my back. What is that little animal you are so tender of? He's my dog, Toto, answered Dorothy. Is he made of tin or stuffed? Asked the lion. Neither. He's a meat dog. Hey, listeners, you've all seen the movie, right? If you haven't even read the book.
Pretty much, right?
Just in case, because not everybody's seen it or read it, Dorothy is a young girl who lives in Kansas in a landscape that the author repeatedly describes as gray. And a cyclone comes in and sweeps her and her dog Toto off to the fabulous land of Oz, a land where all sorts of curious and mostly charming people and creatures live. And so she has to travel up and down this new land, making new friends, a scarecrow, a tin woodman, and a lion, having a bunch of adventures, including inadvertently killing 2 evil witches and dealing with the wonderful but occasionally frustrating Wizard of Oz, all in order to get back to her family in Kansas.
It's a great story.
It's a very fun story. I'm going to say a little bit about the author, and then we'll get all into it because I know you're excited.
Oh my God, I'm so excited.
So Lyman Frank Baum hated his first name, so we will not mention it again. He lived from 1856 to 1919 and was not, in fact, from Kansas, but rather from upstate New York. And he was a prolific writer. He especially loved theater. And so he wrote like at least 42 scripts and over 50 novels with lots and lots and lots of short stories. And also he was a newspaper reporter. But he finally made it big with the publication of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900. And 2 years later, he turned that into a musical, which did very well. And soon, everybody was gaga for Oz. He ended up writing a total of 14 books set in Oz or in the other fabulous lands surrounding Oz. And then, in 1939, it became a middlingly successful movie starring Judy Garland as Dorothy, which then eventually became a hit on TV as an annual holiday special. And that's why so many of us have seen it so often. Did you read the book or see the movie first?
Well, I stumbled on these books as a little kid. I must have been like, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, something like that. And I was just obsessed with them. And I read as many of those I can get my hands on. So all 14 of the L. Frank Baum ones. But then also there was the series just went on. a few different writers continued it. One of them, Ruth Plumley Thompson, they're actually pretty good. So I read a whole bunch of those too, mostly out of the school library. But then I also had some of them, and I have like 2 big stacks of Oz books next to me right now. And I'm like, I only looked back at one of them when I knew you were going to be talking about the Wizard of Oz today. But I'm picking up one and I'm like, oh my God, I remember this one. I remember this one. So there's a lot of emotion attached to them for me.
I saw the movie a lot when I was a kid. I don't remember a time when I hadn't seen the movie.
Yeah, me neither.
And I didn't read the books. Well, I only read the first book when I was an adult, and then only just now read some of the other books in the series. So I didn't grow up with Oz the way that you did. The movie is terrific. I had the wonderful experience of getting to show it to a friend of mine who had gotten to his late 30s without having seen it.
Oh, wow.
It's a real treat to show The Wizard of Oz for the first time to somebody who doesn't know every beat of that movie.
How did they react to it?
And they thought it was pretty good. They weren't blown away by it, but they also understood that maybe they had come to it a bit late. And I don't know if they've seen it again since. They have a kid now. I don't know whether they've shown it to the kid or not.
Well, the kid piece can be really intoxicating. So as I mentioned, I read all of these books. I only read the original one, The Wizard of Oz, first book, right? Literally maybe 5 or 8 years ago because I had seen the movie. So I was like, oh, I don't need to read this one when I was a kid. Right. So I only very belatedly read that book. But the movie was something that I don't remember a world without the movie, grew up with it like you did. But then when my kids were small, they also enjoyed watching it, especially my third daughter, Camilla. And she was little. She was absolutely in love with that movie. And so she'd watch it over and over again. So they had one of these nights in the local theater where they were playing Wizard of Oz. So I took all the kids and we went, and she was maybe 2 years old. So we get into the theater and the opening, the sort of the studio logo goes up and the music of the studio logo goes on. And Camilla stands up on my lap and goes, Dorothy. So the people in front were really annoyed and shushed her, but it was such a great moment, It was this real apotheosis.
That is super fun and sweet and lovely. Well, I think you were right. If you've seen the movie, the novel isn't that different.
No, it's a bit anticlimactic. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few little adventures along the way that are cut for time, and there's a whole final act after the wizard leaves.
And the shoes are different.
Yeah, yes, the shoes are different. The shoes are different because they took the silver shoes and made them into ruby slippers because that would pop in Technicolor better. Fair enough.
I find that a really enchanting point, though, right? Because that's so iconic. That's if you thought of one image from the film, that's super iconic. It's the shoes, right?
They're in the Smithsonian. I have seen the shoes from the movie in person.
Wow.
But yeah, it's absolutely iconic, and they're different in the book. There's also a whole final act where they go to the Good Witch of the South, who is the one who explains the power of the silver shoes to Dorothy. But, either way, both the book and the movie, I think, are incredibly well paced, which is a miracle for the movie because I know there was some real trouble in putting that movie together.
Didn't they have 3 directors or something?
4. Yeah. I mean, most of them only worked on it a few days, but yeah, it was a real hodgepodge. Lots of script rewrites, lots of stuff going on. Absolute miracle that movie came out to anything good. The other thing that I noticed when I was rereading it this time was that, in the book, the Kansas sequence is maybe 3 pages long, and then 1 page at the end. There's way more of it in the movie, and the whole parallelism by using the same actors playing the Scarecrow and a farmhand and so forth. That doesn't exist in the book.
Yeah, this is one of the really interesting differences. I find it incredibly interesting. I don't know if you will think it's interesting or merely weird, is the way color is treated. I don't know if you noticed that in the book.
Oh, of course. Everybody is color-coded from the 4 different regions outside of the Emerald City.
Right.
Although we only get 3 of them in the first book.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, and the color coding, of course, is something that, at least to some extent, is still visible in the movie, to some extent, right? It's not as intense. But there's also, how can I put it? There's a sense in which the color coding is real and it is actually the way that world is divided up. But then there's also a sense in which it's kind of an illusion because, at one point when this is chapter 12, where are they? So Dorothy still wore the pretty silk dress she'd put on in the palace, but now to her surprise, she found it was no longer green, but pure white. The ribbon around Toto's neck had also lost its green color and was as white as Dorothy's dress. So you're
yes.
So what is that saying? What does that mean about is this real or is this an illusion? To what extent is this a real thing?
Well, and they explained it later on, because when they come into the city, of course, they're all made to wear these green-colored glasses, which make things look green rather than blocking green. I don't know. But it makes everything look green. And the Wizard of Oz, who is, spoiler alert, I guess, not much of a wizard, but just a guy from Omaha who stumbled there. He was like, well, it's just easier to make everybody wear the green glasses. And if you wear them long enough, you'll believe that everything is green. And you can just have it be white, and that's much more affordable.
Yeah, it's a bit creepy, right? He says, I thought I'd call it the Emerald City, and to make the name fit better, I put green spectacles on all the people so that everything they saw was green. And Dorothy says, but isn't everything here green? And he says, no more than any other city. But if you wear green spectacles, well, of course, everything you see looks green to you. My people have worn green glasses on their eyes so long that most of them think it really is an emerald city. And it certainly is a beautiful place. And I always think that's such a mind-blowing part, because it's like, so what's real here?
Yeah.
Right? And the movie doesn't give you that at all.
No, not really. No, the book is a lot more interested, or maybe explicit, about the kind of fairy tale logic of it all. Right? That this is a place where stories burst forth, let's say, and they follow a story logic. It's less obvious in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and a little bit more obvious in some of the sequels, I think.
Well, the movie makes it a dream, right?
Well, kind of. I mean, it strongly implies that if you want this to make sense, it's going to be a dream. Like, that was all just a dream. But it's very much not a dream in the book.
No, it's absolutely real. But it's a little bit deceptive, but it's real.
Yeah, but it's real in a very shifting way, right? Like in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, where is Oz? Somewhere in the desert, probably in the U.S. A few books later, in Ozma of Oz, where is Oz? Well, Dorothy's on her way to Australia for reasons. She's going to the other Oz, and there's a shipwreck, and she sort of washes up on the shores outside of Oz. Well, that's a very different place, and that's fine. It's not meant to be super consistent or logical or anything like that. It's, you just entered into this world where different kinds of logic apply. So it's totally willing to engage with that level of fictitiousness in a way that if the movie does it, it does it through things like doubling the actors and so forth.
Right.
Where it's clear that it's a movie rather than clear that it's a fairy tale of sorts. That's where I'm thinking about that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think shiftiness is exactly the way to describe it.
The other thing about like the book and the movie is the character of Dorothy, who doesn't have much of a character in the novel. She's coded a bit younger in the novel than Judy Garland is in the movie, of course. But like I don't know, maybe it's just Judy Garland's performance. Like Dorothy feels incredibly specific in the movie, even though actually, if I think about like what the script is, there really isn't much other than homesickness that she's working off of. But she feels really real.
Yeah.
And the Dorothy of the book is one of the least real feeling characters in the book.
Which is ironic because she's a meat person, right?
Yeah. Even Toto feels more real as a meat dog. So I don't fully know what that is all about. She gets a little bit more personality in Ozma of Oz. And by personality, I mean speech tics. But
yeah, I feel like the later books are so much more vibrant, I have to say. Like they get, I don't know, they're surprising and quirky in ways that I feel like the first book doesn't feel to me as much.
Yeah. Shall we get into that? Let's get into that.
Well, no, when you're ready.
I'm always ready. I am way more excited. All right, I'll say Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a perfectly charming book, though it will be very familiar to anybody who has seen the movie. It is sort of lovely. It's got a sort of gentle irony throughout, which to me now feels very children's literature coded, but that might not be historically accurate. I'm not sure. But like, all the stuff about, he's the cowardly lion. He thinks he's very cowardly, but in fact, the book is constantly showing him being brave. The Scarecrow wants brains and thinks he's not, got stuffing for a head, but actually he's the smart one of the group.
It's very fable-like in that sense, right?
Yeah, it all has this kind of ironic logic to it. The lion is nearly killed by tiny flowers at one point, and the poppies, and is saved by little field mice, that sort of thing. And how Dorothy has had the way to get home the whole time. All these very gentle ironies that are just lovely. All the problems except for the sort of big character problems, they're all dealt with very quickly. It's very charming. The sequel, The Marvelous Land of Oz, gets significantly weirder.
Yeah, it's totally different, right?
Yeah. Now, my understanding is that Baum didn't really want to write more Oz books, but they were way too popular not to do it. He was getting a lot of fan pressure and financial pressure, I think, to do this. He had a lot of theater projects he wanted to fund that were not going to make money. So he needed to milk the Oz cow as much as possible. All right. Marvelous Land of Oz. Dorothy is nowhere to be seen. Instead, we're following a boy named Tip, who's being raised by a witch named Mombi, who is not very nice. So Tip runs away, meets some friends, including a couple that he has assembled, who are brought to life by a magic powder. And he goes to the Emerald City and encounters a Scarecrow, who's now ruling the Emerald City now that the wizard is gone. Except a whole army of girls, of young girls from all across the land, rises up to dethrone him.
Feminism.
We'll talk about that for sure. And what to do? Well, it turns out that there's like a missing royal who really should be the ruler of Oz. Her name is Ozma, but her father hid her away when she was little. Where is she? Where is Ozma? After many adventures, we learn that...
Spoiler.
Major spoiler, we learn that Mombi has transformed her magically into a boy. It's been Tip the whole time. Tip is Ozma. and Tip goes through a magical girl transformation that very much reads like 90s anime tropes. And then Ozma ascends to the throne and is, at least in the next couple of books, a very, kind and good ruler. I don't know if that carries on throughout, but wow, what a weird book.
I know. It's wild. It is incredibly weird.
The gender politics are all over the place on this
one. Off the charts. Like, not just the Ozma gender transformation thing, but also like the whole General Ginger plot,
Yes. General Ginger, leader of the army of revolt of this girl army. Yeah. It's like they're young girls. They want to storm the palace, both out of a sense of like women should be in charge sometimes. Okay, fair. But like also because they want to strip the Emerald City down for parts.
Yeah.
Because they want more jewelry.
I know. And the weird thing is at the end of this, Ginger is like sort of consigned back to, regular life. And she shows up as this really minor, like cameo character in a bunch of the later books.
She shows up at the end of Ozma of Oz, absolutely. For no reason other than just to have her there. You know how sequels work, fan service. And she shows up, she's gotten married. She's a milkmaid now. She married a guy who owns a bunch of cows. Where is he? He's inside. He's got a black eye. He tried to milk my favorite cow.
He won't do that again.
He won't do that again. Like, what? So it feels like it's sort of anti-feminist, right? Like it feels like it's presenting girls having these like girlish things, and there's all sorts of like, oh, now that the girls are in charge, the men have to do all the chores, and they're terrible at it. And it all reads like this kind of parody of feminism. But the book is also deeply invested in having women
running everything,
be in charge.
Absolutely.
And we have a boy narrator? No, we don't. Oh, no, we don't. Not under Frank Baum's watch. We're not having a boy narrator. Get that thought out of your head.
I know, right?
And it turns out, I don't know much about this, but from what little I saw, that Baum's mother-in-law was a big feminist writer named Matilda Jocelyn Gage.
I did not know that.
And he was a big booster of her. And, like, he's very much influenced by some of her ideas. But, like, these ideas are clearly very nuanced. And I do not understand them.
They're refracted, we would say. Yes.
It felt like I was watching a second-wave feminist make fun of third-wave feminists. Or something like that. It felt very, very strange. I enjoyed it immensely. But it was definitely like, what is happening here? But yeah, every powerful character in the Marvelous Land of Oz is female.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Glinda and Mombi and Ozma and all sorts of other. I mean, we've got the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman who are in power in some ways, but neither of them enjoy
they're just
it.
Like second bananas, kind of, Yeah. And there's all different kinds of female power, which I think is really interesting. I mean, Ozma becomes a certain kind of character, after the transformation. Glinda is always there as clearly I don't want to say a more mature person. You know, in other words, you don't have a sense of her age exactly, but she clearly predates Ozma. She's clearly of another generation. She's got all this like sorcery that she's able to do, like which often comes in and saves the day when there's a really bad situation. So, and then there are all these other empowered female characters in different degrees. Like Dorothy is on the one hand just like this really, charming primary character in the different books occasionally, but she occasionally turns out to be able to really make stuff happen in a certain kind of way.
Yeah.
And then in the various books, you have all these various weird, strong, powerful female figures. And so it's like, what is going on there?
In the third book, Ozma of Oz, which is the other one that I read, Dorothy comes back, as I said, going to Australia, ends up in Oz. Except she doesn't end up in Oz at first. She ends up in the land of Ev.
She ends up in the suburbs.
Yeah, she ends up in the suburbs. She's in the land of Ev, which is across the deadly deserts from Oz. And she has some adventures there. Ozma and the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman and the Cowardly Lion all find her there, but they're not there for her. They're there on another mission, which Dorothy helps out in, where they're once again attempting to find some more missing royals. Mm-hmm. The people who should be in charge of the land of Ev are missing.
The Queen of Ev and her children.
Yes, who all have names that begin with Ev. It turns out it's fun.
I know, it's crazy.
I love it. The Gnome King has bought them from their father, from the former king, in an exchange that is gross, but kings are going to be like that, I guess.
Kings are going to king.
And he's transformed them into knickknacks, transformed them into objet d'art that he scatters around. Mm-hmm. And Dorothy has brought with her a chicken, a chicken whose name is Bill, but Dorothy's like, that's not a girl's name, so I'm going to call you Billina, because the Ina makes it a girl's name.
And the chicken's like, whatever.
And the chicken has no time for any of this. The chicken is like straight from Central Casting as a Brooklynite, has the most amazing attitude towards everything, and solves the big thing at the end. It's like this hero of the book.
That's right.
So good. I really enjoyed Ozma of Oz. If the later books are more like that.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It was just a treat. I was just racing through the last chapters of it, being like, this is so much fun. I'm just enjoying the interesting puzzle that is the central. It became a detective novel in a sense, / puzzle book / one of those Star Trek Next Generation episodes where Q is doing weird things with the cast. It's that kind of story, and it's great. I'm all for that sort of thing. I really enjoyed it.
Did you enjoy the Gnome King?
The Gnome King was interesting. Okay, here's the thing about the Gnome King, and I understand that he appears in later books as well, but I haven't read those. But my sense of the Gnome King is that Baum was trying very hard to make an enemy, to make a bad guy who was not that bad. So he's not like out there killing people. He's got a massive army, but he doesn't want to use it. He's trying to be good to his word, but his words are very tricksy.
And he gets very angry.
Yeah, he gets very angry very easily, but he doesn't kill the royal family. He transforms them into knickknacks, and eventually he lets people convince him to have this game where if they solve the puzzle, then the royals will be transformed back and they'll be fine. But maybe they won't solve the puzzle. He makes it intentionally difficult for them and so forth. He's really finely crafted, I think, to be a non-threatening bad guy.
Yeah, and he continues like that. As you said, he shows up in some of the other later ones, and it's very much carrying that forward. He's a really fun character.
Yeah.
The other character I thought you might really enjoy is the Princess Languedere.
So she was interesting. I have seen the 80s movie Return to Oz, and a character based on her is in that.
I didn't know that.
Princess Languedere, the unwilling ruler of the land of Ev, is most notable for having a collection of heads.
She changes her head, yes.
Yeah, once every day, or one for each day of the month. She's got 30 of them. I thought she was fine. That head idea is very good. She was interesting. Is she a big favorite of yours?
God, I was fascinated by this character as a child. I don't know why.
Was it for the heads, or was it
the
just
heads?
because?
I never saw the movie, right? But it was just, I was absolutely enchanted by the heads part, but then also again, the systematic nature of how it works, right? She's got this beautiful sitting room, and there's cupboards, and each head was in a separate cupboard lined with velvet. The cupboards ran all around the sides of the dressing room and had elaborately carved doors with gold numbers on the outside and jewel framed mirrors on the inside. And so every day she'd get up and she'd use the key and she'd take out the head and put it on. She always wore a simple white costume that suited all the heads. For being able to change her face whenever she liked, the princess had no interest in wearing a variety of gowns. Of course, the 30 heads were in great variety, no two formed alike, but all being of exceeding loveliness. There were heads with golden hair, brown hair, rich auburn hair, and black hair, but none with gray hair. The heads had eyes of blue, of gray, of hazel, of brown, and of black, but there were no red eyes among them. And all were bright and handsome. The noses were Grecian, Roman, retroussé, and Oriental, representing all types of beauty.
Yeah, that
and
line.
The mouths were of assorted sizes. I know. And the mouths were of assorted sizes and shapes. It goes on and on and on. And you know how I feel about lists, right?
Yep.
And then we hear about the numbers of the different cupboards. So this was really feeding my my emerging love of lists and categories.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the children of Ev, the royal family, the 10 children, 5 boys, 5 girls, all of their names begin with Ev. I've got the list here somewhere.
Yeah, let's find the passage because it's so good.
They are named Evanna, Evrose, Evella, Evirene, Evedna, and then the boys are Evrob, Evington, Evardo, the eldest, and Everland and Evering. Wow. Amazing. Way to commit to the bit.
Totally.
Royal family of Ev. Also, King Evardo the 15th, age 15, 15 silver buckles on his jacket. That is how he's introduced at the end of the book when he becomes, the king, the restored king, this young prince. There's a real love of that sort of, let's have all the characters have the same name. Let's have these numbers reappear again and again and again. Let's think that way, which again is entirely how my brain worked as a kid and still does.
So orderly. I know. It was just candy.
Orderly only in the most sort of unimportant ways.
No, I know. And I hear the crazy even as we're talking about it, right? But it's so satisfying. Did you also enjoy the lunch boxes?
There's a tree in Ev that Dorothy finds early, which there's one tree which has lunch boxes and another one that has dinner pails. And I thought that was very charming as an idea. I loved it.
Yeah, it's so great. I remember as a child, again, be absolutely transfixed by this. The tree that makes the dinner pails, which were so full and heavy that the stout branches bent underneath their weight. Some were small and dark brown in color. Those larger were of a dull tin color. But the really ripe ones were pails of bright tin that shone and glistened beautifully as the rays of sunshine touched them. And then you open them, and inside, Dorothy finds, nicely wrapped in white papers, a ham sandwich, a piece of sponge cake, a pickle, a slice of new cheese, and an apple. Everything had a separate stem and had to be picked off the side of the box. And then and as a kid, I was like, oh God, if only.
Yeah.
I was so committed to this world. I so wanted to live in this world.
The other thing that I really enjoyed was I was reading from ebooks that I had downloaded from the Gutenberg Project, which meant that I was able to read them with the original illustrations, which especially after they changed illustrators after the first book. The first book's fine too, but the illustrator who does the later books, whose name I should have written down and don't think I did.
John O'Neill.
Thank you, are fantastic. And in particular, major shout out in the second book, in The Marvelous Land of Oz, there is a sawhorse that gets turned to life. And it is just like a sawhorse that kind of looks like a horse, like an actual horse. And but he's a sawhorse, so all of his limbs are very stiff. He can't move around very well. And it's very frustrating for him. And just the drawings of the sawhorse are so adorable. This is the best horse that we've encountered in one of these books since Bill the Pony from Lord of the Rings. I love the sawhorse. If I was a person who would get tattoos, I would consider a tattoo of that sawhorse drawing. Ooh. It is so charming, so over-the-top charming. I just fell in love immediately.
He is pretty great.
The character's fine, but that artwork is stunning.
Yeah, he's a wonderful artist. I agree with you. And it really adds to the experience. I remember as a kid, because they printed paperback facsimiles of the originals.
Yes.
And so I had these as a kid, and I loved the pictures. I remember just brooding over them, just being absolutely in love with them.
And it's not just the pictures, the pictures slide into the text, and the text is very well laid out. It's in a really good font, very readable font. It's just they are well-designed book objects that seem perfect for reading that sort of thing. It's all really good.
Yeah.
Have you partaken in the post-Oz literature much?
Do you mean literature people have written in response to them?
Yeah, the sort of creative rewritings and retellings and expansions that have happened.
Not really. I was so in love with the universe that I kind of, how can I put it? I was hesitant to venture outside of the boundaries of it. It was already so capacious.
Yeah. Back in the 90s, a book came out that I read based on The Wizard of Oz that had gotten a lot of critical attention, and I read it, and it was interesting and enjoyable. It was called Was by a Canadian novelist named Jeff Ryman. It is sort of one of these novels that has three strands, three plot lines going on. There is sort of this one story of an actor who's dying of AIDS in the late 80s, and he has become obsessed with tracking down the history behind Dorothy Gale and Judy Garland. So he's exploring that. And then we also get to see Judy Garland's story as she's, growing up, and her terrible backstory, like all of the terrible things that were going on in her family and how bad it was for her to be a child actor and what she went through with all of that, as well as an imagined story of Dorothy Gale, Gael, young girl whose parents died of diphtheria, who is sent to live in a one-room farmstead in Kansas with her Aunt Anne and Uncle Henry, and doesn't get to go to Oz, but instead has to live a fairly miserable life in that circumstance. It's an interesting book. It is part of, I remember there being a few other books from the 90s that were really this kind of, if I call it misery porn, you'll understand that I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing. It's just you got to know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
Like just a lot of descriptions of the terrible things that are going on in these people's lives, where that is, I don't know how you explore this. It's a real difficult book. I started rereading it just now. I got through the first third of it. I hadn't read it since, back in the 90s. And it's pretty interesting. A few years after that book came out, of course, Gregory Maguire's book Wicked came out, which I have not read. But also, I spent many decades getting very confused about the two books and conflating them. So, when the Wicked movie came out and I saw the trailer for it, I was very confused that it was not about a gay man dying of AIDS. And it was like, they really changed the plot of this one.
Talk about adaptation.
I don't know. Have you seen Wicked or read it?
I haven't. Actually, my children mock me because they all, I think, read it and also saw the film, and they really loved it. So
Yeah. I also haven't seen it. I don't know. I'm sure it's good. It's just
there's so
other things
much.
I'm looking at.
So are you going to read any more Oz books, do you think, in your future?
I would love to read more, especially, are there ones that you particularly enjoy that I should get excited about getting to?
They're all so good. But one of the ones that I was looking back at with a lot of fondness, I think it was the second one I got. So I don't know if it was the second one I read, but it was definitely the second one I got, is The Patchwork Girl of Oz. And one of the things that's kind of neat about that one, I will not spoil anything in it, but one of the things that's kind of neat about it is it has a prologue that explains how the land of Oz has become more cut off than it used to be. So it's explaining how it is that we have the story. So the historian of Oz, this is L. Frank Baum, says, after making 6 books about the adventures of those interesting but queer people who live in the land of Oz, the historian learned with sorrow that by an edict of the supreme ruler, Ozma of Oz, her country would thereafter be rendered invisible to all who lived outside its borders, and that all communication with Oz would in the future be cut off. The children were aghast, right? And they write letters to the historian. And then finally, one of the children asked why we couldn't hear from Princess Dorothy by wireless telegraph. So the historian rigged up a high tower, starts sending messages, and Glinda, luckily, notices this, because Glinda has a big book in which is recorded every event which takes place anywhere in the world at the moment it happens. And so that's how Dorothy heard. And luckily, there was a shaggy man in the land of Oz who knew how to telegraph a reply. And so that's how, after 2 long years of waiting, another Oz story is now presented to the children of America. So it's kind of interesting. So the Patchwork Girl of Oz marks this I don't know if it was a turning point or this liminal kind of point where we're getting everything just mediated, right? Like there's this kind of more remoteness.
Oh, okay.
And it's a very delightful one. It will not spoil things, but there's a character called Ojo the Unlucky who gathers companions around him and embarks upon a sort of journey through Oz that in some ways kind of is patterned after Dorothy's in the original book in certain ways. And it's it's got very memorable characters in it. My favorite one, I think, is the Glass Cat, who has been brought to life and has pink brains that whirl around and around and is incredibly egotistical as a result and will go stand in front of mirrors to watch the brains work.
Yep. That sounds like an Oz book.
Right? That's my favorite character in this book. I think you might enjoy that one, but they're all good. You can't go wrong. The roles I adopted during my stay at the museum often switched. Regardless of my role, however, I continued to take ethnographic field notes and document my experiences. Sometimes my interlocutors forgot that I was first and foremost an ethnographer. At other moments, museum staff explicitly referred to me in these terms and discussed it. They did so, for example, by saying not to note or document particular information, or by saying to document something but not to mention them by name. Sometimes I was taken aside to talk, or told to note particular, usually hot, information. So this is a book called Working Through Colonial Collections, an ethnography of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin by Margareta von Oswald, published in 2022. So it's a fairly recent book. And I stumbled across this because, we were talking about earlier, I'm very interested in museums, but in particular, I was really interested in trying to understand how the Ethnological Museum in Berlin had developed over time, and in particular, how it was being recreated in its new home in the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. And so there are reasons for that, which we could talk about later. But what I was really struck by is that each city that has one of these monumental museums, whether it's the Field Museum in Chicago, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, the British Museum, the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, on the one hand, they're all the same. And there's a way in which you could talk about them all being the same. And then there's also a way in which each one is very much got its own life. And that's what von Oswald's unpacking here. She kind of takes the museum and is like, if instead of looking at the museum as a kind of seamless mediator of knowledge about something, we'll talk about that, what if we instead look at the museum as itself the object of study and we do this ethnographic analysis of the museum? And so it's like really weird, right? So she turns this sort of anthropologist's eye, not on, people from a particular place, but rather on the museum itself and those who work within it and its various aspects. So it's a really interesting approach that for me unlocked a lot of that world.
Huh. All right. So first off, just because this is not a term that I am super familiar with, what is an ethnological museum?
So ethnology develops as a branch of anthropology in the 19th century, and the museums develop hand in hand with it. Like you can't have the museums without the discipline, and you can't have the discipline without the museums. Like they're absolutely going hand in hand. So anthropology as a discipline is branching out into different forms in the 19th century. Physical anthropology that involves sort of archaeology and human remains and so on. And then the observation of the culture of a people. Right. And that's the ethnology. And when you write about it, that's ethnography. So that's a kind of a very simple description of it. I mean, there are much more complicated descriptions of it, but it's not really my field. So that's about, how I understand it. And like I said, the museums develop hand in hand with it. So the systems for managing knowledge are totally tied up with the development of the discipline. And you can see this in all these really interesting ways, like, for example, the way the archive records work and the way in which gaps, for example, in the information that might be associated with individual objects is maintained or not maintained. Like you might think if information is missing, that's like, oh, oops, it kind of like fell out or it was lost or something interfered. But in fact, and von Oswald talks about this, there are many cases in which you can kind of see the stripping away of information as kind of strategic in one way or the other. So anyway, so she unpacks that for us in a very rich and complex way.
Is there an example of that you can give us?
Well, I guess I can answer that kind of obliquely. Like the way she opens the book is in a funny kind of way with a kind of drawing our attention to those absences in a really odd way. She opens with about like 35 pages of photos. Like photos of the museum. And they're like, I don't want to say random, but they're like unexpected. They're hallways, doorways, filing cabinets, a desk, bookshelves, like just these different shots of the space of managing. And occasionally you do see the museum belongings. Like occasionally you'll see a cabinet and inside the closed doors, through the glass of the doors, you'll see, let's say, for example, statues or whatever. So there's this weird sense in what's on display is the apparatus of the museum.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's not quite the same thing as calling attention to the absences, but what it's calling attention to is the thing that is ordinarily kind of almost invisible.
Right. The thing that you're not at the museum to notice.
Exactly. You're supposed to be there to look at the objects, right? And, have this kind of objective knowledge that grows out of it, which allows you to apprehend these cultures, which exist in some kind of eternal present or this kind of timelessness, and not the apparatus that constructs that. And so von Oswald just turns it all upside down. And so you start with, like I said, all these pages and pages and pages of photos, the management system, for knowledge about people, but not all people, right? And so the book itself unfolds chapter by chapter, kind of unpacking all the different parts of this. She starts out with a chapter on the legacy of German colonialism, especially in Africa, because that plays a role in what kinds of belongings come into the museum, obviously. And then a second chapter that talks about the space in which the objects would be displayed. And then she goes on to talking about how to curate and how to display them and her own role as a co-curator and how that shifted her position in the whole undertaking that she was carrying out in this study. And then she talks about the archives, and that's where she gets into the silences. And then finally, she talks about working through, like, what do you do now? And to what extent is connecting with communities of origin possible, and what can come of that? So anyways, there's a lot of ground she's covering, and I was absolutely fascinated by it, actually partly because, and maybe this drew me to the book, years and years ago, I was with some my cousins in Berlin, and one of my cousins said to me, he said, "Oh, there is a plan to rebuild the Schloss," and I'm like, "What?" So this is the palace in Berlin, which was there for like hundreds and hundreds of years, and then survived World War II, was damaged, but was still being used. There's even a film of an exhibition of some art in the Schloss a few years after the end of World War II. The building was in what became East Germany after the war. But then the decision was made to condemn it and to tear it down because it was seen as a kind of reminder and a remainder of what had been in the before time. And so it was replaced by another building, the Palace of the Republic, under the German Democratic Republic. And then that building was also demolished in its own time. And then that space the decision was made to rebuild the Schloss. So what they decided to do was to rebuild the palace. And on the outside, it would look just like it always did. But on the inside, it would be a museum. And what they would put in the museum was the contents of the Ethnological Museum.
Huh.
I know, right? I was like, when I heard this, I was like, what? It was like mind blown, like so much going on there, right? And that's what she's unpacking in this book.
Yeah.
I know, right?
What? Why? Why are they doing that?
Well, there's a lot of different ways of answering this. And I think one way of getting at it is you have to understand how many different kinds of stakeholders were involved in this rebuilding project, right? It was answerable to the public because all the funds to do this were raised from the public. It was determined that this was not going to be something the state paid for. If the people wanted it, the people would pay for it.
Okay.
So all kinds of money was raised, and you can imagine what are the kinds of nostalgia that want to rebuild this Prussian and later German national palace, right? So there's that. And then there's also the fact that, it was built, the Schloss is on Museum Island where all the other museums of Berlin are, right? So there's this powerful argument for if you're going to have a new museum, that's a brilliant place to have it in, right? So there's a certain logic. And then both the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art really needed to be refreshed, rehoused, and they were in another part of the city. So the idea of bringing them into the Museum Island, there was a logic to it. But even so, right? Even so, it's like colonialism is kind of the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah, it feels like an odd choice if you are refreshing and giving new space, I suppose, to this museum of an older and problematic discipline. That, as a stakeholder, as somebody who's like, running the museum, curating the museum, who's trying to think of what this could mean in, the 2020s. And like choosing a reenactment of a incredibly old building and like a palace, like a major imposing, but also like, I don't know, historically screaming of the old times building. Mm-hmm. Seems like not the choice I would make. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so there's this. So I've gotten to know some of the folks who've been working with the Humboldt Forum. That's the name of the new building, right? The Schloss, the Humboldt Forum at the Schloss, right? The Schloss is the building and the palace, right? And then the Humboldt Forum is in it. And so the logic of the name Humboldt it's named after the Humboldt brothers, who were distinguished scholars. And one of them, Alexander von Humboldt, was an explorer who spent a lot of time in the Americas. And so there's a kind of a narrative you can tell about Enlightenment values, and you can talk about, scientific knowledge. And there's one kind of story you can tell that really celebrates those achievements and places the building in that lineage.
Right.
So that is a story. But then there's also this other story that is inescapable, the story of German colonialism, and in East Africa in particular, but, the kind of larger colonial framework that the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, but also all of its partner museums around the world participated in together. They're constantly exchanging and swapping items, like trading cards, throughout the 19th and early 20th century.
Right.
So the building, on the one hand, can tell this sort of celebratory story of knowledge and exploration and so on, but it also has this dark story. Like, both of these are present, and so to their credit, there's a lot to say about how well the Humboldt Forum navigates this, and connects with communities of origin and makes space for proposals and innovation that are coming from outside. So there's that, right? But at the same time, it's like, what does it mean to kind of go from the old museum into this new space? And this is one of the things that von Oswald is unpacking.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not, by questioning this, I'm not saying that they're making the wrong decision or anything. I don't know. Who am I? But there are some obvious surface readings that seem not like what you would want, and some obvious benefits as well. As being on Museum Island sounds frankly lovely. And it looks like a very big space that you can totally use. And as you say, there seem to be ways that you can work with this history and work with this narrative in hopefully productive ways that don't outweigh the other potential readings of it. But
yeah, no, absolutely. And I whenever I'm in Berlin, I go to the Humboldt Forum. I think it's endlessly fascinating to see the way it's constantly changing over time, and there's all kinds of creative stuff happening there. And then I'm also collaborating with some research in the Ethnological Museum, because they still have the storage facilities in the old museum, that you work with. So it's still in this very much transitional kind of period in a lot of ways, right? Even though the museum itself in the Humboldt Forum has been open for a few years now, it's still very much in development. And so one of the things that von Oswald does, which is really kind of neat, is she unpacks this history that goes into the museum for us. And in particular, she unpacks this one aspect that I think is really, really important in terms of what's the logic of the Ethnological Museum? And in particular, what belongs there? And there's a nice little quote where she kind of lays it on the line, talking about the museum's founder and quoting him on how what the logic is of the museum. And she says this: she says, long before the museum's opening, and this is in the 19th century, its founder, Adolf Bastian, excluded Europe and Asia from being the subject of ethnology, and thus from the museum. So you see how the discipline in the museum, right?
Yeah.
All right. So Asia and Europe, he claimed, were to be treated separately from the other continents, and importantly, through the discipline of history rather than ethnology. Right? So in this way, you can define ethnology and its museum as confirming colonial dichotomies of nature and culture, culture and art, civilized and primitive.
Yeah.
Right? So the ethnological goes in that kind of museum. Asia and Europe, they have history. So they go in art museums, historical museums, decorative arts museums, and so on. Right?
When I edit this, I might have to put a very long Marge Simpson growling under all of that.
Yeah, no, I know. No, I know. But that's the logic of it. You have to confront it, right? That's the logic of it.
Of course.
I mean, it's like when you go into, for example, you've been in the American Museum of Natural History, right?
Yes.
You go in there and then, their galleries are closed now, but there was the case that there were these Great Lakes and Eastern Woodlands galleries, Plains galleries, and so on.
Yeah.
They're closed now, but, you'd go in there, right? And the question would be what are people doing in a natural history museum? What does it mean? What is going on here?
They're right there next to Australopithecus, right?
Yeah, and trees and plants and stuff, and there's there is a way you can understand the human being as part of the natural world. There is a beautiful story to tell there, but that's not the story the museum is telling.
No.
Right? And so anyway, so von Oswald then, she's kind of in this role she describes herself as taking on of observant participant, right? As a kind of an anthropologist where her object of study is the museum itself, she kind of daylights this stuff. She says, okay, well, this is the logic, right? And she kind of reflects on it, not just in this critical way. She's quite critical, but she's aware she's both inside the system and outside it at once, right? She's looking at it, but she knows she's part of it too.
Yeah.
And she's very respectful, I think, of her colleagues. Like I could see how this is kind of very sensitive material. Like when they're sharing things with her or saying, yeah, you can repeat this, write this down, you can quote me. Other times they're like, well, you can know this, don't put my name on it. Or, like there's this real sensitivity around what she's doing. And she's like inside and outside at once.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? Like it's a very sensitive topic. There are lots of stakeholders who are not present, the people's being ethnographized or whatever you want to say. Like there are people who are not able to be as part of those conversations as we might want them to be. And also like it's a thing where they're trying to figure out what to do next. So they need to create a space where they can have ideas and process things and try to figure out what's next and not have everything come back to haunt them.
And there's so much stuff.
There's also that, I imagine.
Like, no, but like this, I had no idea until a few years ago what that was that people are these people working in museums are dealing with. Von Oswald talks about the struggle to deal with not only just all the items that are there, but items that flowed back into the collection in 1990, because this is a collection that was acquired, through the 19th century, through the early 20th century. But then after World War II, what happens is the Soviets take quite a lot of stuff back to Leningrad. Right. And then in a slightly later date, in the 1970s, they transferred a bunch of it to Leipzig. And so they're in storage facilities in Leipzig. But nobody knew about this, or at least only a very small circle, just seriously, only a very small circle of people knew about this. So in 1990, right after German reunification, it's like, oh yeah, surprise! Here's a lot of stuff in boxes. Right? So the staff of the museum after that point is just overwhelmed. And so von Oswald says this, here she's speaking more generally, but it's reflecting this cataclysmic influx of stuff. She says, engaging with colonial museum collections is tedious and seemingly never-ending, always in process. The quantity of colonial collections remains innumerable. Much is uninventoried and unknown to museum staff, not only for the Ethnological Museum, but for most ethnological museums in Europe. For example, the British Museum is like this, right? And she goes on to say, as the former storage manager once said about the conservation, storage, and care of collections, I had a lot of ideas in a short period of time. But then I realized that every single idea I have, I need to keep up 75,000 times, referring to the estimated number of objects just in the Africa department. So it's like, so she describes these people working in the museum spaces as like you can only put one foot in front of the other, because if you let yourself look at what's ahead of you, it's impossible.
Right.
And so there's this like, I don't know if like apocalyptic is too much, but there's this like weird tension and apprehensiveness when she's describing the collections that really comes through.
Yeah, it's so okay. All right. So in addition to the kinds of burdens that we might have talked about in terms of like, oh, we have this stuff because of colonialism, to put it very bluntly. But there's also like, and now also we have this stuff which is because of colonialism, but we don't even know what it is. Like it's just in a warehouse, and some of it may not even be well documented. I mean, none of it's documented sufficiently, and some very little, yeah. Yeah, and yet we are expected to be responsible for this stuff, and the people who are in charge of being responsible for it are not the ones who acquired it.
It's the later generations are left with it.
Yeah, and in this case, it sounds like a generation of them suddenly woke up to find out they had a much bigger job than they realized.
Yeah, and she brings this out, like this emotional aspect of it. And again, I find that so interesting. And it comes out in a few different places in the book. And one of the places it comes out is when she's reflecting on her own inside-outside place. And I think that's a really interesting move. She says, what is the role that I can take as a white privileged academic from within the Ethnological Museum, an organization shaped by colonial ideology? To what extent can I bring about change from this position? And she goes on a little bit, and then she says, balancing and withstanding the inherent contradictions is a central emotional challenge in curating contested collections. And she quotes Nanette Snoep, a director in one of the German states. she says, it is not enough to talk a little bit about colonial history, put it in a small showcase, and that's it. The malaise stays, right? So what von Oswald is doing there is bringing out this like this emotional part, right? Like that, there's the work that has to be done, but like there's also a toll it's taking, and you have to account for it. Like you have to try to understand what it is that's going on there in order to get through it. And sometimes, museums will like increasingly one of the tensions, as I've heard various people working in the museum spaces in Europe talk about this. There's a kind of pressure to do repatriation, to like send the stuff back. And on the one hand, that's really important and really valuable. On the other hand, if it's being done just because it's like, we got all this stuff, we got to get rid of this stuff, that can actually be very harmful if it's not part of a relationship building where the communities of origin are ready to receive it and they're supported adequately in the reconnecting with their belongings.
Well, yeah, I mean, that also sounds a little weasel wordy in a sense. Are they ready? Are these people grown up enough to take their stuff back?
No, maybe I'm putting it wrong. There's this worry that, yes, it has to go back, but like, for the right reasons. Like this idea that like, we have all this stuff, let's just get rid of it. Let's just not think about it. Let's just not do the work.
Yeah.
She's saying, she says we have to work through the collections.
Well, and I think especially if you've got a warehouse full of thousands and thousands of items of unclear, uncertain origin, the last thing you want to do, I would imagine, is repatriate it to the wrong people.
Exactly. That's the worst outcome, right? Yeah.
Although, is that the worst outcome? I mean, it's already in that situation.
Maybe that's wrong to say the worst outcome. Von Oswald is making the argument, and I don't think she'd be alone in this, is that what needs to happen is what she calls working through the collections. That is doing the provenance research and connecting with researchers and community members from the communities of origin to build a relationship and to build the kinds of, communication and mutual supports so that when the belongings come back, they come back in a good way.
Yeah.
I mean, she doesn't use quite that language to talk about it, but this working through thing, that's a really important formulation for her. And I think this is a very much an ongoing conversation in the museum spaces. And it's, I think, really interesting.
It reminds me of, and we talked about this a little bit episode or two ago, about the documentary Dahomey.
Yeah, that was in my mind too.
Yeah, which was about the repatriation of some items, but like a dozen items from a collection that had thousands more that they could have repatriated. And the question is, well, we can do it appropriately. Like, this is what we can feasibly send in good condition and be sure that it will be safe in the new space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like, how much of that is true and like a valid thing? And like, it is a valid thing in some sense, but how much of that is, I want to say like administrative bloat in a sense, like ensuring that there will be funds and prestige and all of that going to the people who are going to be doing the work of properly repatriating everything, of working through that collection. Like that feels like a thing that is happening still by the Germans, right? Even if they're doing it in collaboration, it's still sort of happening on the Germans' timeline and using the Germans' people and resources to ensure the rate at which that happens. And I'm sure these discussions are happening. I mean, they're happening in the movie, and I'm sure they're happening in the Ethnological Museum as well, amongst the staff of that. But like, it's tricky. It's very tricky.
Yeah. No, we were talked a little bit together about Dahomey, which was this 2024 documentary directed by Mati Diop. And you're right. It was a small number of items. I think it was 26 items that were among some of the most meaningful and powerful belongings coming from what's now Benin, right? And it was really interesting in that film, and maybe we talked about this a little bit, to see the ways in which people described what it was like to reconnect with their belongings. And some, I think you commented on this, feeling a kind of sense of connection, and others being like, I don't know what to make of this, right? That there is really a process in reconnecting to the belongings. And it's ideal when that's being well supported. So von Oswald doesn't talk about this a whole lot, but I know about this separately just from visiting at the Humboldt Forum. one of the things they've done is develop a kind of set of partnerships with communities of origin that kind of have their own space in the forum and have actually exerted a lot of influence on the timeline of various kinds of activities. Like, remember you were saying like the German institutions may be doing it on their own time? Like, there is absolutely some of that. But there's been a space created for the kind of pushing back from the communities.
Good.
Yeah. So that's why I find it such an endlessly interesting physical space, but also like, I guess, space of where meaning is made kind of, because, on the one hand, it's got these very conservative kind of elements. Like I mentioned already, the people who are raising funds to restore the Schloss to its former glory. And they're constantly doing more. When I was there, like, about a year and a half ago, somebody was telling me how they want to restore this monumental staircase that was in one of the inner courtyards, where there's a staircase on one side and the other side is kind of a flat ramp, because that's where the ruler used to ride his horses up to the second floor.
Oh, yeah.
So there's that, right? And then there's also like the small c conservative forces of the museum that kind of want to do things the way we've always done them, right? There's always that, right?
Right.
And then there's, there are people working in the museum space who are curators or conservators or provenance researchers who are kind of pushing to expand what's possible within that space. And so there's this like very complicated kind of ecosystem. And, we're talking specifically about the Humboldt Forum and the museum there, but you could tell a version of this story in Paris or in London or in New York or in Chicago and so on, in all these like colonial metropoles.
And it sounds to me like von Oswald is, as you say, sort of reflecting the emotional difficulties as well as the logistical and all the other like aspect and the theoretical and all this, but like the emotional difficulties of embracing that expansion or dealing with it, like just dealing with change, which
is hard.
It is hard. And I mean,
and the weight of history, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so interesting.
Well, that was a really diverse conversation.
I know. So what's the common ground there?
I mean, there is something about how Baum structures the different cultures and the different peoples that he populates this world with that probably replicates some of the thinking that goes into the Ethnological Museum.
No, totally. Well, I mean, for me, totally systems of knowledge. And I have a tiny little anecdote in that. Like, at one point, I wanted to write a little article about the Wizard of Oz or about the Oz books. And in particular, it will not surprise you to know that what I wanted to write about was the cartographic imagination of the Oz books and connect that to like medieval world maps and stuff like that. And I couldn't finish it. And the reason why was I was just way too emotionally invested in the whole thing. And it just kept going in all these different directions. So it's the great unwritten Oz article. Oz maps article. Someday maybe, but I was just too intoxicated by it. I couldn't do it.
Well, what have you been otherwise reading or working on lately?
Well, the last throes of an editorial project, which are always like take forever.
Yeah.
But I can't complain because I was doing it with a wonderful collaborator, Melissa Moreton, who did all the tedious work. And we just produced a volume that's called Textiles and Manuscripts, a local and global history of the book. And so it's a collection of wonderful pieces on book history. So manuscripts, but also early printed books from a whole range of cultural environments, clusters of people working each on a book or a set of books from that tradition. So it's really wide ranging and it was fun to do. And I enjoyed writing the introduction. I always enjoy the kind of synoptic part of it. Like, what's the big picture?
This is a book that is priced for academic libraries rather than the general reader, it looks like.
Alas, but we are hoping that it will be accessible online before too long. So in a more open kind of way. And, like we don't tell the press this, but we usually share. Yeah,
that's a thing. If you just email the academic and they often will just share something, it's fine. They love the attention. Well, that's very exciting and congratulations. That is a huge amount of work to get done, even if former guest of the show, Melissa Moreton, did the gruntiest of the grunt labor on that.
She's a brilliant codecologist and wonderful with images. She's an artist as well as an academic. And so it's going to be a beautiful volume with tons and tons of pictures in it. And that's all her good work.
That's marvelous. I've did the sort of other end of the spectrum recently, so to speak. It was Independent Bookstore Day not too long ago as we recorded, although maybe about a month ago when this episode goes out. And did I celebrate. Toronto has not as many as it used to, but still a nice number of very lovely independent bookstores. And we had a friend in town, who we used this as an opportunity to show off the great variety and diversity of bookstores around. And I made it a challenge and a rule. I had two rules, two things.
Mm-hmm.
One, I was going to buy something at every bookstore that we went to.
Mm-hmm.
Because you gotta support the independent bookstores.
How many stores did you go to?
Many. The second rule was that if I saw a book that clearly should be in my collection, but that I had never heard of, I had to buy it.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's a risky rule.
It is a very risky rule. I would share a photograph of my haul, but it would not fit into, there are not enough megapixels in the world to fit all these books. It's so terrible. There's a whole, no. I haven't even started any of them yet. There's my to-read pile just got more massive, but it's very exciting. First off, it was
I want to see a
lovely
picture. I don't care how many megapixels it is. I want to see the picture of the books.
One of the books that I went to, we have a fantastic sci-fi bookshop here in Toronto called Baka Phoenix, and I picked up a book there, but I also picked up a mystery bag because they had $5 mystery bags. Of course I'm going to pick up a $5 mystery bag, especially when the little what's in this bag maybe clue on the outside was written, what even is this?
So what was it?
It was a collection of books coming from various decades of mass market paperback books from the 60s through to the early 2000s. Every single book, you could tell exactly when it was published based on the cover. They were all the most pulpy of pulpy, nothing I'd ever heard of. Some of them looked kind of potentially fun, but I don't know. It was all very just oh wow, this is definitely going to be this. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It was a real delight to go through that bag and play around with it.
That's excellent.
So good. It was so much fun. I was so glad I did it. And it was a lovely day, and it was just lovely to walk around it was lovely to go around the city and see all these things. And Independent Bookstore Day. So good. Everybody go do it next year when it comes around again in April.
Oh, it sounds really good.
I'm sure I will get around to reading some of those books someday and then talking about them on this podcast in the future.
Yeah, when are we going to do more Oz books?
Maybe next month I'll have a few more, and that'll be what I talk about when you talk about, you'll be in the driver's seat, so I can just talk more about Oz again. Who knows? Who knows?
Oh, that sounds great.
I'm glad we finally got to do it. It's kind of weird that we didn't do it before.
Well, there's always more.
There's always more. Listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We would always love to hear from you. And this show is made possible by people just like you supporting us on Patreon. And our patrons get to hang out with us on a friendly Discord. And if I'm going to share my book haul, it's probably going to be there. Find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/81. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So, until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.